Hey, Rob, welcome to the Virtual CMO podcast. I'm glad you could join us today.
Hey, Eric, I am thrilled to be here. Thanks for having me.
I'm glad you're here today because I think you are now the second or third guest that I've had on this podcast that has
Mhm.
actually been a connection from Lunch Club. That has proven
Yep.
to be a very valuable networking tool. How have you found it?
Oh, I totally agree. I've had wonderful conversations with people really all over the world. And, because I am in marketing, such as yourself,
Yep.
I can pretty much connect with anybody because every single person I speak to on Lunch Club either has bought my services before or needs them again. So it's wonderful.
No, that's great. One of the things that I'm interested in talking to you about today, because we're going to get into this whole idea of branding, especially around personal branding. And one of the things that I notice on a tool like a Lunch Club, and it could be the same for a social profile on Twitter or on LinkedIn or whatnot, but there are some people who have nothing. They don't load up a picture. They don't put anything in their description that says what their interests are or who they are or what they do. They really just have their name, their position, and maybe the company that they work for.
Right.
Deconstruct this a little bit. That's terrible personal branding right out of the gate.
Well, it's anti-branding actually is what it is. And the way I like to talk about personal branding, it is the story that you tell about yourself and you put out there into the world. So if you meet someone who doesn't have a title or doesn't have a photograph or doesn't have any description, I just see that as a lost opportunity because you need to do a lot of work to figure out who that person is. Now, as a matter of fact, through Lunch Club, at the beginning of the conversation, people introduce themselves and say what they do. And I've had many people, successful people, who just kind of trip, stumble, and fall when it comes time to talking about themselves, which also gives me a wonderful way to pivot to what I do,
Sure.
which is basically helping people create a brand narrative that gives them confidence to walk into any room and feel really good about themselves.
Yeah, because a personal brand isn't your job description, right? I'm a
No.
doctor, I'm a lawyer, I'm a marketer. That's what you do. That isn't who you are. That's not your brand.
No.
When you look out there and we should probably talk about celebrities because they're brands that many people would know and recognize. But who do you see out there that really has done a stellar job with their personal branding?
Oh, so many people come to mind, but one person I'm particularly intrigued by these days is Lady Gaga.
Mm,
Who kind of came on the scene with her meat dress and being very
right.
extreme and very outrageous. And over the course of her career, her brand has stood for so much. I mean, she is famously loyal to her fans, has an incredibly loyal fan base, and they will follow her anywhere. So she could be singing at the inauguration, she could be singing at the Super Bowl, she could be singing on the Academy Awards, or she could be singing with Tony Bennett. They're going to follow her wherever she goes
Right.
because she has a very consistent message. She's extremely inclusive, and she has a lot of integrity, and I think people respect that about her. I mean, if you can get a hug from Julie Andrews after doing a Sound of Music medley and then be with President Biden as inauguration, that says a lot about someone.
Yeah. And I love that you focus on the consistency out there and the things that people stand for as a way to really identify themselves to a cause that may be larger than they are. And I think that that's so important too as people cultivate their brand, whether you're posting things on LinkedIn or you're posting things on Instagram or whatever. We all know that content is cultivated, but what direction are you taking it, right? What are you trying to tell in terms of a story? And that gets to the whole idea of building that personal brand story. What are
Yep.
some of the elements that you think make a really strong personal brand story?
Well, when I work with people to develop their personal brand narrative, the very first thing I say to them is, you're fine just the way you are. So be your authentic self.
Mm.
And if you try to put yourself out there as something that you're not, A, it's not sustainable, and B, it's often not very credible. So
Yeah.
the very first thing I tell people to do when developing a personal brand is take a really good look in the mirror.
Mm.
And identify, what are my key strengths? What am I really good at? What do people turn to me for? What am I really proud of? List all those things. And then on the other side of the paper, write things you know about yourself that maybe aren't so flattering. You have to understand who you are to tell a good and strategic story. So the first thing, take a look in the mirror and really do an honest assessment of yourself. So what you think of yourself is interesting, but even more interesting is how you are perceived by others. Jeff Bezos famously said, a brand is what people say about you after you've left the room. So what I recommend clients do is do a survey monkey and identify, 6 or 8 or 10 people who you really respect and ask them if they will answer some questions about your personal brand. Always tell them they can answer anonymously, but ask them questions like, what is Eric best at? If they were to make a movie about Eric, who would play him? If Eric was a car, what make and model would he be and why? And the reason I have questions like this, these are all associations, because if it's someone they're not going to want to say negative things. But if you figure out the car and you figure out what you're best at and you figure out who would play you, a picture emerges of how you are perceived in the marketplace. So then, of course, you have to say, okay, this is how I see myself. This is how people I respect perceive me. Where's their commonality? And where is there areas for improvement? And where can I go with this? So whenever I help people develop personal brands, I always say be as aspirational as possible, because you don't want to be judged on who you are necessarily today, but the person that you could be, or where you want, or how you want people to see you. So that's the first thing I recommend. It's basically the same as doing market research.
Yeah.
It's the same as I would do for any other client. So that's the first step I recommend. And once you do your research and have your data, the next thing that I suggest people do, and I think this is a very high level, Eric, obviously,
sure.
But there are certain building blocks that you need to tell your story. So what I suggest people do is, based on what you've learned in your research and what you know to be true about yourself, what are the top 3 messages you want to put out there in the world? And I purposely say 3, because if you tell people 2 things, it's not enough, and 4 things, it's too much. People like 3s. So what's the first thing you want people to know about you? What's the second thing? And what's the third thing? And once you kind of nail those key messages, out of that can come a really terrific elevator speech. I think people still use that expression, but basically it's a short statement to describe who you are. And the reason why this elevator pitch is so important is that it is what you're telling the world you want them to know about you. So for example, when I tell people about my background, there are a couple of key things I always mention. I mentioned having had a career on Madison Avenue, working on high-end lifestyle brands. I talk about being a marketing strategies columnist for the Wall Street Journal. I talk about being an independent art dealer. I talk about being a consultant. And I give them sort of highlights. And all of those highlights that I share are conversation starters. Yeah. Because there's always a point of commonality with someone. So my recommendation is, when you're developing your messages and you're developing your elevator speech, give people just a little catnip, give them something that's going to intrigue them and ask them to explain more. And that's when you can tell your authentic story. And once you have those brand elements together, what I recommend, and I know that you know this because you do it so well, is to go narrow or go wide, but tell your story. So it's all about being extremely consistent. So when I see you on LinkedIn, and then maybe I see you on Instagram or Facebook or Twitter, what are you consistently saying about yourself? Because if you're putting disparate messages out there, it's very confusing. And here's sort of my premise for doing all of this. We are so deluged all day long with alerts and news and headlines and all this stuff. People just get news and alerts all day long. So you need to tell a story that is short, unique, and compelling. And what I always like to tell people is that even though I'm personally very long-winded, my expertise is helping make a long story short, because that's all people have an appetite for today.
I love that. And I love the way you frame that, because I think that's very digestible to people. And, you started out talking about asking people sort of what they think of you. And I love the fact that you do that through associations, because people don't like to say negative things, but sometimes through an association, you can start to say something about somebody without actually saying it. And I love that. I've also heard from people, why do people call you on the phone? What advice are they asking you? What are you a perceived expert in? What draws people to you? And if you start to look at that, even though it may be hard to identify for yourself, there are clues all around you, right? From your friends, from your family, as to what people really think your skills and attributes are.
Well, let me give you a recent example. So I work with a lot of financial services professionals and lawyers because they're always trying to differentiate their expertise from the zillions of other people that do the same thing.
Sure.
So I was working with this one guy, and he was like, late 50s. He had a good book of business. But he wanted to catapult into a different area. So he said, Rob, my brand narrative is nowhere. Can we work together? So a perfect example of what I just said to you is when I asked him, well, if you were an automobile, what make and model would you be? And he said, oh, I'm a Ferrari. I'm fast. I'm sleek. I'm cutting edge. And catch me if you can.
Right.
Okay. So when someone tells me something about themselves, I tend to believe him.
Yeah.
And then I spoke to, we did the Survey Monkey to some of his clients. They did not see him as a Lamborghini. They saw him as a Toyota Camry, a Honda Accord, a Buick Regal, real middle of the road, reliable, get the job done from point A to point B. And I said, okay, you've got a huge disconnect here. You think you're here, your clients see you here. So we need to give them some data points so they see you more as the Lamborghini and develop a narrative that basically markets against what their perception of you is.
And I think that gets to that whole authenticity as well, right? You can see people, especially online, this is so common, that are clearly trying to portray themselves one way, but it comes across as inauthentic. There's just something that you say, this doesn't match. This isn't a fit for this person that I know, but they're trying very hard to present a certain image that just isn't who they really are.
And it's not sustainable. But you know what, Eric, I got to say, when I turned 50, which was a couple of years ago, all of a sudden, I felt very different. I mean, I've been in the corporate America for years and years and years. And at 50, I just said, you know what, I'm going to be exactly who I am. And my clients will find me, and they will like me or they won't like me. And it's extremely liberating to be authentic to who you are, and then unabashedly put that persona forward in areas that you can have your most success.
Yeah, there is something very gratifying and rewarding about just being an authentic person, just really being yourself. And that doesn't mean you can't grow or you can't, work on areas of your life that you want to change and make better. But if you are really true to who you are, that doesn't mean you have to show all the bad stuff, right? You don't have to sort of let everything hang out there. But
you do not.
Yeah, you want to accentuate the things that are truly the best parts of you.
Right. You brought up how people put themselves out there. And I'm a huge LinkedIn user, supporter, believer, because in business, in these times, if you're speaking to someone on the phone, you've already gone to their LinkedIn profile. And that tells you everything that they want you to know about you. Mm-hmm. And what I've discovered is a lot of people are doing a really lousy job of positioning themselves. Yes. So for example, we all have our picture right here, and behind us is a banner. Yes. And I tell my clients, that's your billboard. Mm-hmm. So you might want a picture of a mountain range that looks evocative of I don't know what, but instead you might want to say, this is what I do. So if you go to my LinkedIn profile, you'll see it says brand strategy, mission, vision, workshops, and personal branding. Those are the 3 buckets of things that I do. And then people also fall down often when it comes down to writing their title. So if you put down VP of marketing, that tells me everything, tells me nothing. It doesn't tell me how you work. It doesn't tell me what the benefit is I would get by hiring you. It's not clever. It's not interesting. It's completely generic. Then the most important thing is that whole about me section, because a lot of times people say, I've done this, I've done that, I've done this, I've done that. And they keep on saying, okay, that's great. We can all read your resume, but what you should really focus on is not what you've done, but what benefit do you bring others? Because that's basically what everyone is interested in. What can you provide to me? What can you give to me? And people don't realize that.
No, that's such an important point, because it really is about giving value, and you want your personal brand to be, giving as well. And one of the things that you mentioned earlier, sort of as you built that personal story, was finding things as ways that you can connect with your audience, with people that you're speaking with. I don't know how many times I've been in a networking session where somebody's just going on, and there's no opportunity to grab onto anything that they're saying and contribute. It's a monologue. It's not a conversation.
Well, that is like a pet peeve of mine when people, particularly at formal networking groups where people say, get up and introduce yourself. And I'm going to really date myself here, but I feel like people like slip in that diskette and they just blah, blah, blah all over the place. And it's full of jargon and it's full of platitudes and it doesn't mean anything.
Yes.
And, I'm a reasonably intelligent person, Eric, but I very often find myself in front of people who are going on and on and on about what they do, but I don't understand it at all. I can't track.
Yes.
Just last week, I had a new client, and she had just made a big investment in having her resume redone. She hands me this resume, and it was a mess. On the left-hand banner, there were her expertise, and there were 12. And then there were her social skills, and then there were 10. And then there were some education things over here. And then there was her employment over here. And I said to her, okay, I'm reading all your titles. I don't even know what field. I think you're in healthcare. I can't really tell.
Yeah.
So I can't tell what you do, and I don't know where to look. And so that's an example of someone just throwing spaghetti against the wall and feeling as though they have to mention all the buzzwords or whatever that their industry is looking for. But in the end, it was just a big, confusing mess.
Yeah, I see that so often. Intentionally on this podcast, we don't open every episode with me asking the guest, tell me a little bit about yourself. Because oftentimes when I've done that, 15 minutes into the show, we're still going through that introductory paragraph of tell me who you are, right? And so we've got to take that offline now because so many people haven't developed that elevator pitch, that good personal brand story to sort of sum it up, get people interested. Instead, they go through a litany of accomplishments and what they've done and where they've worked, which quite honestly is boring. There's another show out there. It's another podcast. I won't throw under the bus, but it's another CMO podcast. And they bring on a lot of Fortune 500 CMOs. And it's this love fest where they just talk about all the people that they've worked with and name drop this and this company, that. But they're not giving anything back, really. They're not giving anything of value that people can really relate to.
Right.
I think you have to have those openings where people can really start to engage with you.
Well, and that's the whole thing, because you made a wonderful point at the top of this conversation. Is you want to have a conversation starter. You need to give someone something to hold on to.
Yes.
So you give them your greatest hits of your career, and hopefully someone will connect on something somewhere.
Yes. How would you sort of differentiate? Because I think we're all familiar with branding in terms of what happens for companies, right? What you want to do, your logos, your fonts, your colors, all of this kind of thing. But how do you say, or how would you look at corporate branding as being different than personal branding?
Well, personal branding is more personal.
Well, there you go. Okay.
That's the whole thing, because, the lion's share of my career has been in corporate brand strategy. And the way I got into personal branding was about 7 years ago. I had rebranded an executive search firm. And when I was done delivering their brand blueprint, which they were going to use to update their website and sales and marketing materials, the CEO said to me, Rob, this has been super helpful in helping us, move the needle in the company, but I'm having trouble with my consultants because they're on the phone reading their scripts and they're trying to connect with the prospects, and it's just not landing. Can you help develop a personal brand for them? So, when you're a consultant, the answer is always yes.
Yeah.
So
right.
I said, of course I can help you. And then I very quickly realized that the same tenets I use to brand a corporation can be nuanced and refined to brand an individual. So the approach isn't really that different. And we're a company, they might have to rely more on things like, their logo or their imagery or their theme song or their website or something. With individuals, it's how you put yourself out there in the world. It's
Oop, hang on a second. I think we just lost Rob. I need one of those little graphics that pops up on the screen that says, please stand by, technical difficulties. We'll see if we get Rob back here. Oops, we lost him. We'll give him a second to rejoin. This is the beauty of live television. You just never know what's going to happen. Hey, hey. You still there? Hey, Rob, I can see you, but I still can't hear you. Oh, there you are. I see movement. Hey, Rob, I can see movement. You're moving again. Are you there? Hey, Rob, can you hear me? Can you?
Me?
I can hear you now. Yeah, you're breaking up quite a bit. Did you lose internet?
Eric?
Hey, there you are.
Oh my goodness. I don't know what went on. And if it was my fault, I apologize.
That's very odd. Yeah, it the picture just kind of froze up there for a second, and then you disappeared. So, who knows what's going on there in the internet? We'll just cut that part out of the center of the video. It's not a problem.
Okay, awesome.
Yeah.
So you were asking me the difference between corporate and personal branding.
Yeah.
Should I take it from the top?
Yeah. Let's go into that.
Okay. So when I work with corporate clients and I give them a brand blueprint, I mean, they're worried about things like messaging and positioning, which is no different than an individual. With corporations, they might be more reliant on things like logos or color palettes or fonts or theme songs. But with individuals, it really is about how you present yourself to the world, because people will make assumptions about the things that you intentionally tell them. If you'll just indulge me for 1 minute, because this really was a mind-blowing experience for me. So I have always driven BMWs. It was just my thing. I loved them. And then I got divorced. And I thought, you know what? I'm over the BMW. I'm going real practical. So I got a Toyota Venza.
Okay.
Which I thought was a nice car. It was a new model that was kind of cool, kind of SUV-ish. Anyway, so I was pitching business with an agency, and we met at a hotel. We pitched the business, and then we came down to the concierge to get our cars, and my car was the first one that came out. And the president of the agency said, "Is that what you drive?" I said, "Yeah." She said, "Don't let the client see that. It's not a good look." And I thought, well, that wasn't very nice.
Right.
And then about 6 months later, I was picking up a client, a paying client who I had just rebranded. We were going to a conference. He got into my car. He said, "This is what you drive?" I said, "Yeah, I really like it." He said, "I just don't kind of see you this way."
Yeah.
Then the third time, about 4 or 5 months after that, I met a client from New York, and he took the train from New York to Connecticut, and I drove to Connecticut. We had our meeting, going out for dinner, and I picked him up in front of the hotel, and he said, "Rob, I'm really confused. I thought you drove from home." I said, "I did." He said, "Why do you have a rental?" And I thought, okay, those are 3 data points.
Sure.
3 people who work with me, and they're looking at the automobile that I drive, and they don't think it's a connect with the value that I'm bringing them. It was a bad reflection on me. So just when you think that people aren't making judgments and assessments on those things, they truly are. And that really, well, you know what I did, Eric.
You got
I
yourself a
returned that
BMW.
car. I returned that car for a BMW.
Yeah.
But I couldn't believe it happened. So people look at how you present yourself and the things that you surround yourself with. They're cues and they're clues to who you are.
It's interesting that you say that, because if you're listening to this in audio, you can't see, but I wear a sport coat every time I do one of these interviews. And so far, of every podcast that I've been on, I'm the only guy, that's wearing a sport coat in, 95-degree heat. But nobody has ever questioned it, because those people that know me know that that's just very much who I am, that's just sort of the look that I would have. Even when I worked in a very casual office environment, I was the guy who put on a coat every day to come in. And it's just like you said, it does it mesh with who you are, doesn't it?
Well, I'm really glad you brought that up, because when we first locked eyes on this podcast, I'm like, oh, geez, I should have worn a sport coat. but you presented yourself with such professionalism. And I really appreciated that. And it told me something about you without saying a word.
Well, it's interesting because, these are visual cues, right? And when you talk about corporate brands versus personal brands, I've had several guests on the show. I had one young lady who she wore green. That was her color. So everything on her website was green. Every picture of her I had a green. Same thing. I had a guy who was into purple. And so everything that he did, his backdrops, his ties, his shirts, everything was purple. He was trying to associate that. You look at somebody like an Oprah, she's got a font, right? If you see Oprah spelled out, it's always sort of in that same swirly font. So even some of those same corporate branding tips you can employ for personal branding, because it can help people identify you better.
Yeah. And also, it helps people to understand who you are and what you're offering.
Yes. Yes. Well, and you said it before, we live in a sea of notifications. There's so much noise coming at you, and little visual cues, I think, can really help people sort of say, oh yeah, that's the guy. He was the guy wearing the sport coat, or, oh, he was the guy in the purple shirt, or something like that. Little things like that, I think, can help make a big difference as you take that to a business card or a personal website, or, as you said, your LinkedIn profile and what you're doing on that banner. So, no, go ahead.
Well, what I was going to say, that there's some congruence here between individuals and corporate branding, and this is particularly true after COVID. But people don't want to just support companies that sell them things that they want. They want the companies and the brands they associate with to actually stand for something and actually care about something above and beyond what they're selling. And that is the exact same thing for individuals. So to your point, Eric, if someone goes through a litany of their skill set, well, that tells me what you do. It tells me nothing about you. And if
Mm.
you want to be part of my organization, or you want me to hire you specifically, you need to give me something more.
Yes.
And I think a lot of times people were just sort of genericized, and they were trying to be, professional by toting the line and using the jargon, all the buzzwords and stuff. But it ends up just being a sea of sameness.
A sea of sameness. I think there's also some risk of associating yourself with things that aren't authentically things that you really believe in or support. I think we're recording this in July. June was Pride Month. I can't tell you how often I got on LinkedIn and people had changed their icons to be rainbow colored. When there was the protests and the various movements that have been going on, people have supported those. But that literally might be the only time that you ever heard anybody talk about some of these issues. And sometimes I think that kind of branding can come across as being very inauthentic.
Well, if it's a one note or a
Yeah.
one off, I should say, there's no value to that. But, obviously I noticed, there's been such heightened awareness of social justice in the last, 2 years or so, that I kind of disagree with you in a way. If someone wants to, put a pride flag on something, at least they know that they should care.
Yeah. Well, that's a good point. Yeah.
At least they know, okay, I need to at least telegraph to the world that I am aware of what's happening in the world, and I'm just going to raise my hand and say, yeah, this is what I'm going to do. And if it's inauthentic, if it's just a one note, well, that's not too good. But I think it's kind of better than nothing. I mean, baby steps.
Baby steps, right? But it would be great to see people take that to the next level, right? And say, okay,
Oh.
I'm not just going to do it for 1 month. I'm going to, talk about this multiple times during the year, or make it part of my profile, or whatever. We just keep coming back to this whole idea of authenticity, and it's so important. So I'd love to know a little bit more about how you help clients. What's a typical engagement look like? How does somebody come to a personal branding expert and say, hey, I need your help? What does that look like?
Usually people come to me. I have, sort of 3 buckets of clients. One, I did not mention to you that when I started doing those personal branding workshops, in one of those workshops, somebody told the professor at Boston University about my workshop.
Okay.
And this professor asked me to come and basically teach it at the graduate level, which I've been doing for the last 5 years or so.
That's great.
So what she knew was that she was going to graduate all these newly minted MBAs, and they were like deer in the headlight. So they needed a launch story. They needed a launch story that was going to differentiate themselves from the person next to them. So I work with a lot of recent graduates. I work with mid-level people trying to get to the next level in their organization, or to be perceived in a different way.
Okay.
And then finally, I work with C-suite executives, because I know you know this to be true, Eric. It's lonely in the C-suite.
Sure.
And I think it's lonely because the C-suite is expected to, that's where the buck stops. And a lot of times the C-suite doesn't want to appear vulnerable or appear not to know something, because of course that is their responsibility. But in having that wall up, it creates a distance, and people don't really understand who they are personally. So when I work with someone, it could be any number of things. I help people to develop those key messages that we talked about, the 1 or 2 or 3 things that they want to communicate to the world, what they're all about, what their value, and what it's like to work with them. That's the first thing. And then we do the elevator speech. And a lot of times there'll be some either presentation skills training or mock interview training. So I'll help people prepare for an event. Very often I help people update their resumes, which, like the one I explained to you before, was just a hot mess. Yeah. And then I also do LinkedIn profile updates. So it's how you walk into a room, and then it's how you market yourself through social media, basically, and your resume. But it takes on a life of its own, because some people, I have this thing called speed branding. It's 90 minutes. And prior to that 90-minute session, I go through a questionnaire with clients, and then I ask them, what are the key areas you want to work on? And what's the one question you want answered for you to feel so this 90 minutes was worthwhile? So I have a lot of people doing that because it's not expensive and it's easy and it's fun. But then there are also the the multi-meeting coaching that I just explained to you before. And I also have that personal branding workshop that I offer to corporations. So it's, it's like a training element for COVID workers working remotely, talking them how to develop their personal brand. So those are the 3 buckets. And then of course, I'm just available on counsel when situations come up. A lot of people have social anxiety, and I can sort of help talk them off the ledge so they can feel good about that next meeting or that presentation or what have you.
Well, and we also live in a time when there are some fantastic creators out there, especially younger people. They just seem to have a knack for creating great content and really building a lot of these personal brands. Others, of certain demographics, it's a little bit more intimidating to get out there and create that online persona. And we live in a digital world now. You really need to have some online presence as well.
Oh my God. It's not a nice to have, it's a got to have. Because if you're not on LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter, or some combination thereof, you don't have a profile.
Yeah, that's right.
You don't exist.
It's like a company, right? If they don't have a web page, a website, they don't exist because people are going to look for it. It's so important.
Well, this is something I also recommend with personal branding. Always keep your lights bright, always, and particularly on LinkedIn. So every week I post something. It's either original content or I'm sharing something that I learned, something relevant to what I do. I mean, for me, all roads lead to branding and personal branding. So I do that every week, and I always comment and follow other people. And I really recommend everybody do that. It doesn't take a lot of times, but it keeps your lights bright and people know who you are, and you never know where it's going to go.
Yeah, I love that. Lights bright. I like it. Rob, how can people get a hold of you?
Well, the best way to reach me is rob@brandyoubetter.com. That's BRANDYOUBETTER.com. That's the best way.
That's perfect. I'll make sure that we have all that linked up in the show notes so that people can find you there and online, because they should check out that LinkedIn banner if you're looking for an example of what you should do with that real estate that's there, and you should take advantage of it for sure. Rob, this has been a great discussion. I love talking about personal branding, and I think you've given some very practical advice here today. So thanks so much for being a guest on the show. I've really enjoyed it.
Eric, I thank you too. This is wonderful. Thank you.